Jake hurried along the cracked sidewalk, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing night air. The city street was nearly empty, except for the dim glow of streetlights flickering above him. His hands were stuffed into the pockets of his worn-out jacket, the only thing keeping him warm. The wind howled through the alleyways, sending shivers down his spine. As he passed an old convenience store, something caught his eye, a figure huddled against the brick wall, wrapped in nothing but a thin, tattered blanket. The man was frail, his head bowed low, his hands trembling as he tried to warm them with his breath. His clothes were dirty and full of holes, barely enough to protect him from the biting cold. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, but Jake could see his lips quivering, his body shivering violently. People walked past without so much as a glance, avoiding him as if he were invisible. Jake stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. He wasn't rich. His own family barely had enough to get by, but something deep inside him wouldn't let him walk away. He slowly unzipped his jacket, hesitating for a moment as the cold air hit his skin. He only had one, and he knew he would regret not having it later. But then he looked at the man again, his fragile form, his desperate attempt to stay warm, and the decision was made. Without a word, Jake stepped forward and gently placed the jacket over the man's shoulders. The man flinched at the unexpected warmth, looking up with wide, weary eyes. For a moment, their gazes met. There was a flicker of surprise in the man's expression, followed by something else, something Jake couldn't quite describe, gratitude, maybe even disbelief. "You need it more than I do," Jake said softly, forcing a small smile. Before the man could respond, he turned and walked away, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as the cold immediately bit into him. The man watched him go, his fingers clutching the jacket as though it were the most valuable thing in the world. The man sat still, his fingers gently gripping the jacket draped over his frail shoulders. The warmth slowly seeped into his body, easing the violent shivers that had plagued him all evening. He ran his hand over the fabric, feeling the softness against his skin. It wasn't just a jacket, it was kindness, given freely by a boy who had nothing to gain. His weary eyes followed the boy as he walked away, disappearing into the night without expecting a single word of thanks. A slow, knowing smile formed on the man's chapped lips. He pulled the hood back slightly, revealing more of his face beneath the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. A couple walked past, whispering to each other, throwing him the same pitiful glance that so many had before. But then, the woman suddenly gasped, clutching her partner's arm. She stared, eyes widening in shock. The man beside her frowned, confused, until he too recognized the face beneath the hood. "It can't be," the woman murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's him, that's Mr. Harrington." The name sent a ripple of disbelief between them. Mr. William Harrington, the reclusive millionaire, the man who had built an empire from nothing, the philanthropist who had donated millions to shelters and charities. The same man who had vanished from the public eye years ago, leaving nothing but rumors in his wake, and yet here he was, sitting against a brick wall in ragged clothes, looking no different from any other homeless soul on the street. Mr. Harrington met their gaze briefly, his sharp eyes glinting with quiet amusement. Then, with a slight shake of his head, he pulled the hood back over his face. The couple hurried away, whispering furiously, but he paid them no mind. His thoughts remained on the boy who had just given him his only jacket. He exhaled deeply, his breath swirling into the cold night air. Few people in this city knew what true kindness was. Tonight, he had found it in the pure heart of a young boy, and tomorrow he would make sure that kindness was rewarded. The sun had barely risen when a firm knock echoed through the small, worn-out house. The sound startled Jake, who was still rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He sat up on the thin mattress that served as his bed, blinking at the door. His mother, dressed in her faded robe, wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and exchanged a puzzled glance with him. They rarely had visitors, and the only knocks they heard were usually from the landlord reminding them about overdue rent. Jake stood, stretching his arms before padding toward the door. The wood creaked as he pulled it open, revealing a tall, sharply dressed man standing on the doorstep. His black suit was immaculate, his shoes polished to perfection. Everything about him screamed importance. Jake swallowed hard, suddenly feeling underdressed in his old, oversized sweater. "Are you Jake?" the man asked, his voice smooth yet commanding. Jake hesitated, glancing at his mother, who had stepped closer with concern in her eyes. He nodded slowly. The man reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick envelope, holding it out. "This is for you," he said simply. Jake's heart pounded as he took the envelope, feeling its unexpected weight in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the flap and peeked inside. What he saw made his breath hitch. His mother gasped behind him, her hands flying to her mouth. There was a letter, but beneath it, money. More than he had ever seen in his entire life. Stacks of crisp bills, neatly bundled together. His hands felt clammy as he pulled the letter out, his eyes quickly scanning the words. The letter was signed by a name he recognized instantly, William Harrington. Jake's knees felt weak. The kind old man he had given his jacket to last night wasn't just any homeless person. He was a millionaire, and he had come back for him. Jake's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter, his eyes darting over the neatly written words. His mother stood beside him, her breath shallow, as if she too couldn't believe what they were seeing. The weight of the envelope was nothing compared to the weight of the moment. His fingers tightened around the paper as he began to read aloud. "Dear Jake, sometimes the greatest wealth is not in what we own, but in the kindness we show to others. Last night, in the freezing cold, you gave away your only jacket without hesitation, expecting nothing in return. In that moment, you showed more generosity than most people with fortunes ever do. What you didn't know was that I am not a beggar. My name is William Harrington. Many know me as a businessman, but last night I was simply a man in need of warmth. And you, without knowing who I was, offered me kindness that cannot be measured in money. People often look at those who have less and turn away. You didn't. That means more to me than I can put into words. This envelope is just a small token of gratitude. It contains enough to change your life, but more importantly, I hope it reminds you that true wealth is in the heart. Never stop being the person who helps others without expecting anything in return. The world needs more people like you. Sincerely, William Harrington." Jake's voice wavered as he reached the end of the letter, his throat tightening with emotion. He stared at the name, unable to fully process what had just happened. His mother covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes brimming with tears. The house had always been filled with struggles, late rent, unpaid bills, empty kitchen cabinets, and now, in his hands, was the answer to their prayers. Jake looked back into the envelope, his fingers brushing over the thick stacks of bills. This wasn't just money. This was a new beginning, a life-changing gift from a man he had helped with nothing but a simple act of kindness. Jake's mother sank into the worn-out chair by the kitchen table, her hands still covering her mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at the envelope, her breathing unsteady. The weight of their struggles had always pressed heavily on her shoulders. Late bills, overdue rent, nights spent worrying about how to put food on the table. And now, in a single moment, everything had changed. Jake's fingers still clutched the letter, his mind racing to catch up with reality. He had only wanted to help an old man in need. That simple act, one that had come so naturally to him, had now brought a miracle to their doorstep. His mother reached out, placing a trembling hand on his arm. "Jake, this is real, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded, though he still struggled to believe it himself. The kindness he had shown without expectation had returned to him in a way he never could have imagined. He carefully set the letter on the table and reached back into the envelope, pulling out the neatly stacked bills. His mother gasped, shaking her head in disbelief. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she clutched his hands. "Do you realize what this means? We don't have to struggle anymore. We can pay off the rent. We can—" Her voice broke and she let out a choked sob. Jake swallowed hard, feeling his own eyes burn. He had never seen his mother cry like this before, not out of relief, not out of hope. Just then, the door creaked and his younger sister peeked inside, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Mom? Jake? What's wrong?" she mumbled. His mother wiped her tears quickly, turning toward her daughter with a watery smile. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," she whispered. "Everything is finally right." Jake let out a shaky breath, his heart swelling in his chest. The world had tested them so many times, and for once, kindness had repaid them. That afternoon, another unexpected knock echoed through the house. Jake's heart skipped as he opened the door, only to freeze in shock. Standing before him, dressed in a perfectly tailored coat, was Mr. William Harrington himself. But this time, he was no longer in disguise. His presence was commanding, yet his eyes carried the same warmth Jake had seen that night on the street. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a small smile, Mr. Harrington reached into a sleek shopping bag and pulled out something familiar, a brand-new jacket, almost identical to the one Jake had given him. He held it out. "I believe this belongs to you," Mr. Harrington said softly. Jake hesitated, staring at the jacket before slowly reaching out to take it. The fabric was thick, warm, the kind of jacket that could last for years. His fingers ran over it as emotions swirled in his chest. I don't know what to say," Jake murmured. Mr. Harrington chuckled. "You don't need to say anything, Jake. The kindest hearts never ask for anything in return, yet they always seem to receive more than they give." Jake swallowed, gripping the jacket tighter. He had given away his only coat without a second thought. Now, not only had he been given a new one, but his entire life had changed because of that one small act. "I hope this serves as a reminder," Mr. Harrington continued, placing a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. "Never stop being the person who helps others, even when you have little yourself, because kindness always finds a way back." Jake nodded, his heart full. He would never forget this moment. More than the money, more than the jacket, this was the lesson that would stay with him forever.